I said heading into 2014 that I thought Jim Caldwell was the right choice to take the Detroit Lions job. I think it is important when you move on from one head coaching philosophy, one head coaching personality, one head coaching style, to go to a different direction and choose a different type of leader with a different type of personality and a different type of style. And that's not being foolish. I think that is the way to go, because why would you bring in somebody just like your old head coach, Jim Schwartz, when you're firing Jim Schwartz because he ultimately failed? That doesn't make any sense to me. So I applauded the Detroit Lions when they hired Jim Caldwell and anticipated that he was going to help turn this team around in 2014, and that the Lions were going to be a serious threat to win maybe 10 or so games and potentially even sneak into the playoffs. Well, lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. Even with flashes and moments of time where the Lions were still the Lions, I mean, they got some improvement. They went from 7-9 last year to 11-5 this year. They finished second in the NFC North. They had a very, very good season. And really, frankly, they were really close to beating the Dallas Cowboys in Dallas in the wild card round of the playoffs. To go from a Lions team that imploded all over the place in 2013, that shot itself in the foot so many times, to being a team that even when it tried to shoot itself in the foot would still find a way to win more often than not. They managed to find a way to win 11 games and come very, very close to winning a playoff game on the road. That's a hell of a season for the Detroit Lions and something for them to build on heading into this offseason going forward into the 2015 season. One of the biggest keys for the Lions' success and why they found themselves in a position where they can make the playoffs in 2014 was, in my opinion, the fact that they went 5-1 in the NFC North. They swept Minnesota, they swept Chicago, they beat Green Bay once. When you go 5-1 in your division, it's going to be very hard for you not to make the playoffs. The single biggest key to success, or the single best way to ensure yourself a playoff position, is to obviously win your division, but at least, if nothing else, be successful in your division. And that's what the Detroit Lions were in 2014. They were able to largely handle business, even though they failed to do so in Week 17 in Lambeau against the Packers. They, for the most part, handled their business within the division. They finished 5-1, and that reflects in their 11-5 record for the season. And the primary reason they did this was off of the strength of their elite defense in 2014. It's funny, you bring in an offensive-minded head coach, you send out the old defensive-minded head coach, and this defense got worlds better, frankly, in 2014. I mean, this Detroit Lions defense was legit. Tied for second in the league in points allowed, second in total yards allowed, first against the run in all of the NFL, and the top 10 in the league in sacks. I mean, this defense was dominant at every single level. They were impressive, and it was surprising to me just to see how dominant and elite of a defensive unit the Detroit Lions really were. I mean, they had 11 of their 16 games where they allowed 20 points or less. When you do that, you're going to win a lot of football games as a team in the National Football League if your offense can do anything at all. The surprising thing about the Detroit Lions, though, in 2014 was that their offense wasn't all that particularly good. I mean, they were 28th in the league in rushing yards. They had 10 games where they scored 20 points or less. For a team with Megatron, they brought in Golden Tate, who had a great season himself. A quarterback like Matthew Stafford, who's thrown for 5,000 yards before in the season. You would have expected that the Detroit Lions offense would have been more explosive and would have produced more than they actually did. They were just kind of a middle-of-the-road offense in 2014. And that was perhaps a big contributing factor to this Lions team finishing 11-5 and second in the division and having to go on the road in the playoffs, as opposed to them maybe winning one or two more games and winning the NFC North and or getting not only a home playoff game, but maybe a playoff first-round bye, and maybe even in the NFC home field advantage throughout. It was that offense that, frankly, really held this team back in 2014. Still some untimely turnovers, injuries to Calvin Johnson that minimized his effectiveness during the middle portion of the season. The fact that they really didn't get much out of their first-round pick, Eric Ebron. Imagine if they would have taken Odell Beckham Jr. to be that guy out of the slot to go with Golden Tate and Calvin Johnson. Could you imagine? Oh, my God. Injuries to Reggie Bush that kept him ineffective and out of action for a good portion of the season. And the lack of consistent running game, the ability to play that type of physical style of football on the offensive side that really would be able to take some pressure off of Matthew Stafford. You know, there were times where this Detroit Lions offense, frankly, just ground to an absolute screeching halt. They couldn't really run the ball all that well, and they didn't have enough weapons on the outside to be able to compensate for that. And then they still would have those times where Stafford would make those bad throws and those terrible decisions. This is a Lions team that in theory looks like it could be on the precipice of doing even bigger things. But they have some serious problems here. They've got to figure out a way to get Matthew Stafford to stop being that dick tease and to take that next step, to go beyond just being a borderline franchise quarterback to being a real deal franchise quarterback and going to that almost elite level where he does have that potential to go. They need to be able to get more out of their running game. I mean, they finished 28th in the league in rushing yards. That's not good enough, especially when you have that type of big-time defense. You should be able to win games if you run more games if you run the ball better. They need to find a way to take some of that pressure off of Matthew Stafford. They need to be able to figure out a way to open things up more for Calvin Johnson and Golden Tate on the outside. They need to figure out a better way, frankly, in 2015 to get Eric Ebron more involved in the passing game. They need to figure out what they're going to do with Ndamukong Suh, who is a free agent, who is very likely to potentially not return to the Detroit Lions. What does this Detroit Lions team do when Suh was the basis of so much of what they did on that elite defense in 2014? I mean, this is a Lions team that isn't that far off, but when you look at it, they've got a lot of holes, and they've got some major flaws, and they've got some major questions heading into this offseason. Now, in terms of the things that they need to address in this offseason, first and foremost is the Ndamukong Suh situation. With all the money they're paying Calvin Johnson, with all the money they're paying Matthew Stafford, can they really afford to devote another huge portion of their salary cap to one player on the defensive side of the ball? When it comes to Ndamukong Suh, I mean, he has been that factor. He has been that beast for the Detroit Lions over the course of his 5-year career with the team. But would they be better off replacing him and allowing him to leave via free agency and reinvesting that money in other places on the defensive side of the ball and within the organization? I mean, that's the first key. That's the first thing the Detroit Lions are going to have to figure out. What they're going to do with Ndamukong Suh. Are they going to re-sign him, and what is their plan if they do? Are they going to franchise tag him for 1 year and punt the ball down the road? And then, if so, what are they going to do? If they allow him to leave via free agency, and they let him go, then what are you going to do? What's your contingency? What's your backup plan? How are you preparing yourself? I mean, these are critically important questions for a Detroit Lions organization. In terms of other things they need to figure out, though, they need to figure out where they're going to get that lead back from. They need to figure out where they can get a better running game from. They truly do. Their biggest need in this draft, in my opinion, is at the running back position. They've got to be looking at Melvin Gordon. They've got to be looking at Todd Gurley. They've got to be looking at a running back as soon as round 1. I know a lot of people are of this belief that the Detroit Lions offense doesn't need that much help and that the running game is a lot better than it was. Well, I assure you, 28th in the league in rushing yards means you have problems in the running game. I think Jock Bell had 800-something rushing yards, and the next closest guy had like 280. Somewhere in that range. That's not good enough. That's not going to get it done in the National Football League. And when you look at a team that had 10 games where they scored 20 points or less, and you had that elite defense that finished second in the league in points allowed, second in yards allowed, first against the run, top 10 in the league in sacks, clearly to me the offensive side of the ball is the biggest need area. And the biggest need area on that offensive side of the ball would be at the running back position. They also could use some depth on that offensive line, both inside and at tackle, but especially at guard. Perhaps they could use a replacement for Rob Sims at left guard. I think that's something that they definitely need to explore. It looks like they found their replacement for Ayola at center and Travis Swanson. But they could use some help on that offensive line. But offensively, they must find that 3-down back. They must find that franchise-featured difference-making back. They can't sit there and continue to go the committee crap and expect that to work. It didn't work in 2014. They must find that guy. And they're in a good position in this draft in a running back class loaded with talent at that position to be able to address that once, if not twice, in the 2015 NFL draft. But in my opinion, if it sets up right, they need to address that need in round number 1. They do also need to explore defensive tackle. Even if they bring in Ndamukong Suh back, then Nick Fairley's a free agent. You're probably going to move on from him. If you let Ndamukong Suh go, you might let Nick Fairley go too. You could be looking potentially for 2 starters on the interior of your defensive line, a unit that was elite last season. Do you want to take a big step back on this side of the ball? The Lions are going to have to find a way to address that defensive tackle hole via free agency. Do they allow an Ndamukong Suh to go, or do they bring in a Terrence Knight via free agency as one example? A lower-cost alternative to a Suh. While not literally the player of Suh, a Terrence Knight would be a somewhat suitable replacement that would allow you, again, to reinvest in other areas of that team and on that defense where you especially need to in the secondary. When you're still starting Rashawn Mathis, who is in his mid-30s, you've got some issues in the secondary and the cornerback position. So many people last year believed that this Lions team needed to add talent and depth in their secondary, and they frankly really didn't do that. And, when you look at the first and second round picks of Ebron and Van Noy, those picks could pan out, but right now they seem like a couple of mistakes, if I'm being honest. So maybe they should have addressed that secondary earlier, because it may show in 2015, if they don't address that secondary, just how much of a vulnerability that secondary is. This is a good Detroit Lions team. This is a Detroit Lions team that, though they're good, is close to teetering on the edge of taking a big step back in 2015. Now, if they find a way to make some key improvements in some key areas, they could, tread water right where they were in 2014, or maybe even improve a little bit upon that. This is a team that is still something to be reckoned with. I'm just not sure if we can expect them to be 11-5 again in 2015. But it was a good season. It was an important season for this Lions organization, and definitely something to build off of going forward.